Good morning. Welcome to Family Life Christian Church for our Sunday school for Matthew 19. We want to welcome everyone in on Facebook land and internet land and here that are face-to-face with us in the church. And we invite you and welcome you to come every Sunday at 9 o'clock for Sunday school. So let's go ahead and begin in prayer. Father God, we thank you, Lord, for this time together. We thank you for your word, Lord, that it just resonates in our spirit, Lord, and we ask that you just continue to show us your word, show us your precepts, show us your heart, Lord, for us. And today, as we talk on some difficult subjects, Lord, we just ask that you just quiet our spirit so we can hear what you have to say to us, Lord. And we just ask that you bless this time and anoint this time, Lord, and we just thank you for your word. We thank you for your love and your mercy and your grace for us, Lord. And just open our ears to help us to hear your word. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So in chapter 19, Jesus teaches on some very tough topics. One is marriage and divorce, riches and discipleship. So to set the stage for Matthew 19, Jesus has taken us on his ministry on the road. As Linda mentioned last week, Jesus did a lot of his ministry in Capernaum, which was his hub where he spent a lot of his time. But now we see him traveling south toward Judea. And looking at a map of the region, you would see the Sea of Galilee with Capernaum on the northern shore. And that's where he did a lot of his ministry work. Then due south from there, there's the Jordan River running through the valley into the regions of Samaria, Decapolis, Perea, where it ends into the Dead Sea in Judea, with Jerusalem being to the west. Now, if you have a red letter Bible, you'd see that Jesus is doing a lot of teaching because he knows his time is short and he's trying to impart everything he can into his disciples while he's still with them. However, there are also those that are following him not to learn or be healed, but to see if they can catch him teaching blasphemy or anything that goes against their rules and customs. And this is where we begin our study of Matthew 19. So in verses 1 and 2, Jesus heads towards Judea and Jerusalem. Verse 1, now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these sayings, that he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And great multitude followed him, and he healed them there. So the records of Matthew, Mark, and Luke focus on the Galilean ministry of Jesus and only emphasize his presence in Jerusalem right before his crucifixion and resurrection. However, this trip from Galilee to the region of Judea was not unusual for Jesus. The Gospel of John tells us many previous visits he made to Judea and to Jerusalem. And Matthew points this out so the readers understood the popularity and power of Jesus was not restricted to Galilee. It was also evident in Judea, so it was not uncommon for Jesus to make this trip. Then in verse 3, we see that the Pharisees, they're trying to trap Jesus in things that he says and teaches. So in verse 3, it says, the Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? How many of you know Jesus is about to take them to school? So speaking of school, we're going to go pretty in depth to explain this simple question. So let's talk about divorce in America for a moment. According to the Weatherspoon Institute, about 48% of all marriages in America end in divorce. And this divorce rate also applies to Christians as well as non-Christians. And if you cohabitate or live together before marriage, your chances of divorce are even greater, which is probably opposite of what you're thinking and takes away from the rationale of living together. So sadly, many who have been divorced feel like second-class citizens or like failures, but this shouldn't be the case. Today, 40% of families in the U.S. are blended families with at least one partner having a child from a previous relationship before marriage. I have a heart for blended families. It wasn't that long ago where there was not a lot of resources for blended families to turn to for help. Thankfully, that's not the case today, but that confirms the need for resources that these families need as the family issues are compounded with all the added variables. So Jesus gave a pretty good characterization of someone who has been through a divorce when he announced his public ministry in the temple after his tempting in the desert. As we see in Luke 4:18, Jesus was handed the Torah, and he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor." If you've ever been divorced, you know you can get pretty poor sometimes, especially after depending on that second income. And then he says, "He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." And this is a pretty good characterization of someone who has been through a divorce. And in John 3:17, it says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." So Jesus came to save us, not condemn us. However, if we don't receive Jesus, then we're condemned already. So let's take a look at the Mosaic Law and see what it says about divorce and how the Pharisees were trying to use it to trap Jesus. In Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 and 2, it says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife." So it's clear that the Mosaic Law has a provision for divorce. And the key word here is uncleanness. And uncleanness does not mean adultery. And how do we know that? Well, look at Leviticus 20, verse 10. "The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress, shall surely be put to death." So according to the Mosaic Law, you didn't give an adulterer a bill of divorce. They were to be stoned to death. So that was according to the dispensation of law. The dispensation of grace is different. So according to Leviticus, the Mosaic Law called for death of an adulterer. And that's how we know Deuteronomy was not talking about adultery when it used the word uncleanness. So back to Deuteronomy 24, 1 and 2. It says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife." Now, uncleanness is translated from the word erva. It always applies to some type of serious offense. In fact, it is defined as indecent, shameful, or highly improper behavior. So Moses recognized that under certain circumstances or conditions, divorce was necessary in those type of situations. The problem was that some people wanted to divorce for minor offenses, not just these highly improper offenses. So they were looking for ways to get around technicalities of what Moses had written. So people started going to rabbis asking if there were ways to get around what Moses had written. So the rabbis started scrutinizing what was written to see how they could get around it. And what they were really doing was twisting it to say what they wanted it to say. Does that sound familiar in today's culture? So during the time of Jesus, there were 3 very respected rabbis with all different philosophies. You have Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai, and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Hillel concentrated on the word sum in verse 1. Sum is translated from the Hebrew word daba, which means matter. So he taught that if a man found any matter of improper behavior, he could divorce his wife. Now this could be interpreted as speaking disrespectfully to him, burning his food. Yeah, Lord help us on that one. No, my wife's an awesome cook, so she never burns food. She doesn't. She's really good. I'm in trouble now. Lord help me. All right, not making the bed right or not keeping the house clean enough. So those were considered a matter of some type of uncleanness. The second school of thought came from Rabbi Shammai. He concentrated on the word uncleanness. To him, improper behavior was anything considered contrary to the moral and religious customs of the day. If your wife wore her hair down or had her arms uncovered, if she had a slit in her robe up to her knees, you could divorce her. So it was contrary to the moral and religious customs of that day. The last one was the most liberal thinking of them all. It was from Rabbi Akiva, and he concentrated on the phrase, finds no favor in his eyes. So he said a man could divorce his wife if he no longer found her attractive, or if he found someone more attractive, or if he just fell out of love with her. So as you can see, there were 3 schools of thought. So you could just switch to whatever school of thought you wanted that would fit your situation. So at that time, you could pretty much get a divorce for just about any reason if you want, much like today. But today we use the term irreconcilable differences. So this was the culture by the time Jesus arrived on the scene. So let's see how Jesus handled the issue of divorce. In Matthew 19, verses 3 through 10, it says, the Pharisees also came in, testing him and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So they are no longer 2, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. They said to him, why then did Moses give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? And he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. His disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. So notice in verse 3, the Pharisees were testing him. They were trying to find something to discredit his ministry. They didn't like Jesus because he was attacking all their rules and regulations, so they perceived him as a threat. Notice the question they asked him in Matthew 19:3. Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for any cause? So in verses 4 and 5, Jesus went back to the original intent, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So back to creation and Adam's statement in Genesis 2:23. We see that men and women, as husband and wife, are different, yet they are joined together as one, completing one another as one flesh. Adam said this at the creation of Eve. It was as if Adam said, you're different than me, but you are made for me and from me. We are not the same, but we are one. So in Genesis, Adam tells us that men and women are different from creation. Different sources of creation, different methods of creation, different times of creation, and different names at creation. So this whole idea of feminism is fundamentally flawed from the very beginning of creation. Women were not made to be like men, and men are not made to be like women, regardless of what processes you go through to change it. To overcome the snares of the Pharisees, Jesus focused on the spirit of the law. Now, Scripture validates Scripture. By using the story of creation, Jesus demonstrates the rules of marriage as being consistent from the very beginning. One commentary says, in quoting Genesis 1:27, Jesus indicated first that God made men and women different, and that God joins men and women together in marriage. In this, Jesus asserts God's authority over marriage. It is God's institution, not man's. So it is fair to say that his rules apply. And in verse 6, we see what God has joined together. So Jesus also reminded the Pharisees that marriage is spiritually binding before God. Marriage is not merely a social contract. And as God has joined, he expects man to honor what he has joined and to keep the marriage together. Now, the Greek word used here is sunexusen. It's hard. Look German to me because it's so long. But it means yoked together as oxen in the plow, where each must pull equally in order to bring it on. Among the ancients, when persons were newly married, they put a yoke upon their necks or chain upon their arms to show that they were to be one, closely united and pulling equally together in all concerns of life. So in Matthew 19, verse 7 through 8, it says, they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So the Pharisees wrongly thought that God commanded divorce where there was uncleanness. And one rabbinic saying of the day went, if a man has a bad wife, it is a religious duty to divorce her. But Jesus noted the difference between command and permitted. God never commands divorce, but he does permit it. The Pharisees thought that Moses was creating or promoting divorce. In fact, he was controlling it. So regarding the hardness of the heart, sometimes the heart of the offending party is hard, and they will not do what must be done to reconcile the relationship. And sometimes the heart of the offended party is hard, and they refuse to reconcile and get past the offense, even when there is contrition and repentance. Often, the hardness of the heart is on both sides. In a perfect world, there would never be divorce. But because of sin, sometimes divorce is necessary. So that's what Jesus is saying. Jesus affirmed the Mosaic law. He did not contradict it. So in Matthew 19, verse 9 and 10 says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry." So the King James Version uses the word fornication instead of sexual immorality. God didn't want anyone to get divorced except for one reason: fornication. According to Jesus, fornication is a justifiable cause for divorce. So our mission now is to find out just what this word fornication means and what Moses meant by the word uncleanness. So in Matthew 19:9, again it says, "I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." So notice Jesus did not say except for adultery. He said fornication. So the word fornication comes from the Greek word porneia. And adultery is translated from the word moikao. Those are two different words. Jesus used the word porneia. He did not use the word moikao. So what's the difference? Well, adultery, moikao, refers to extramarital sex. Any form of sex outside of marriage is considered to be adultery. So how far can you go before it's considered sex? Well, according to Song of Solomon, God considers sex anything from the neck down. You fondle the breast, you rub each other's bodies, that's considered sex. God created sex as a way for a couple to have pleasure within a marriage relationship, to have mutual satisfaction. And foreplay is part of that. So for all of you unmarried people who think we can do all these things except for having sex, that's not true. Told you this would be a tough message. So adultery is any form of sex outside of marriage. What's fornication? Most of us have been taught that fornication is sex before marriage. And according to Google and Webster's Dictionary, fornication is sexual intercourse between people not married to each other. But that's what it means in English. Porneia actually means licentiousness, which is a disregarding of accepted rules and standards. It means unrestrained, especially towards sexual sins, but not exclusive to sexual sins. So when applied to marriage, it means a refusal to conform to covenant standards. When porneia is used in the context of marriage, it means a refusal to conform to covenant standards. People tend to think fornication only means having sex between people not married. In this context, it refers to a refusal to conform to the biblical standards of a marriage covenant. And here's 5 examples. 1, each partner is required to love, honor, and cherish one another. Sounds familiar to your vows that you may have taken if you're married, right? Ephesians 5:29 says, "For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church." So no man would ever abuse his own body unless he has a mental illness. Therefore, a man should never abuse his wife, nor a wife abuse her husband. And that includes throwing chocolates across the room. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, mental abuse are all the breaking of rules and standards of God's standard for marriage included under porneia. The husband is required to financially support his family in 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And another version calls it an infidel. So a man that does not provide for his own family is worse than an infidel. If a man can work but doesn't, he hasn't been in an accident, or there is nothing keeping him from working, then he's not upholding his covenant obligations. And before you send me a nastygram, yes, it is okay if the husband and wife agree that the wife makes more money, that she works, and the husband stays at home and takes care of the household. But generally speaking, a man is supposed to provide for his wife. And number 3, the wife is required to take care of the home. According to Titus 2, 4 and 5, it says that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands. So wives, your primary responsibility is to raise your children to be godly and independent. It does not mean you can't work outside the home. As a matter of fact, the Proverbs 31 woman helped the husband bring in income to the home to be a helpmate. Titus 2, verses 4 and 5. Okay. All right, then the 4th thing, neither are to sexually deprive the other. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 4 and 5, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Having sex only on special occasions, once or twice a year, is a breaking of the marriage covenant. And all the men said, amen. It does not mean to have it whenever he wants, but we are not to deprive one another. So both are required, the 5th thing, both are required to remain faithful. You take vows to promise to keep only to one another. No one else comes into this covenant relationship. Not the in-laws, not the biological children, no one. Porneia may include adultery, but it's not limited to adultery. Porneia is not leaving your dirty underwear on the bathroom floor or leaving the toilet seat up. And all the men are like, oh, thank God. Continuing arguing or not helping with the housework is also not porneia. Those might be irritating, but does not constitute the breaking of the marriage covenant. If you're fighting all the time, see a counselor. Learn how to fight fair and how to resolve conflict. Because of sin or a hard heart, sometimes God does condone divorce. But if you do get a divorce and that was not for breaking of the covenant relationship, you cannot remarry. If you do, it's adultery. But we'll tell in a minute. In Matthew 19:9, it says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So you can see that Jesus and Moses said the very same thing because uncleanness and fornication are the same. So when is remarriage considered adultery? Well, let's go back to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the later husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the later husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. So if you get a divorce because of uncleanness, you're free to remarry. If someone is married to someone who refuses to live by biblical covenant marriage relationship, they are justified to divorce that person, and they are free to remarry. Not being in love with one another is not grounds for divorce. What if you have been divorced and it does not meet the qualifications for divorce? Well, let's take a look at John chapter 8, verses 3 through 5. And the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? As we saw in the story, no one was free from sin, thereby unworthy of casting the first stone. So farther down that chapter, John 8, verses 10 through 11 says, when Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. So if you've remarried and you've asked for forgiveness, you've been forgiven. Jesus gives us incredible grace. There is not one sin that you can't be forgiven except for the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, which is the rejection of Jesus Christ. And it's only blasphemy if you die without receiving Jesus Christ. So we also remember that the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 17, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. So in the context, one of Paul's ideas with this statement was a warning about trying to undo the past in regard to relationships. God tells us to repent of whatever sin there is and then to move on. If you're married to your second wife after wrongfully divorcing your first wife and you became a Christian, don't think you must now leave your second wife and go back to your first, trying to undo the past. As the Lord has called you, walk in that place right now. If you've remarried, God recognizes your present marriage. How do we know that? Take a look at the book of John, chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have said well, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly." So Jesus recognized each one of her marriages. If you're not married but living together, their story proves you're living in sin. What about homosexual marriage? God does not recognize your marriage. I don't care if you got legally married or not. I don't care what kind of laws Congress passes to protect same-sex marriage. God does not recognize it. If you're living together or cohabitating, God does not recognize your feelings of, well, we're married in God's eyes. No, you're not. Go get married. Make those covenant vows to God and to each other. If you've had multiple marriages, God forgives you. God wants to give you eternal life and an abundant life. He is faithful and just to forgive us. We just need to ask. Told you that'd be tough. Some tough topics there. All right, in verses 10 through 12, the disciples asked about marriage and celibacy. So in verse 10 it says, his disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it." So in verse 10 it says, "If such is the case, it is better not to marry." So the disciples understood Jesus' teaching on marriage and divorce clearly. They understood that it was not a commitment to be entered into quickly or lightly, and considered that since marriage is so binding before God, then maybe it's better not to marry. So in verse 10 it says, all cannot accept the saying, but only those to whom it has been given. So Jesus recognized that celibacy is good for some, for the one who is able to accept it, such as Jesus himself and the Apostle Paul, as we saw in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 7 through 9. Verse 12 says, "For there are eunuchs who were born thus." The term eunuch was used figuratively for those who voluntarily abstained from marriage. Jesus gave 3 kinds of eunuchs: those who are born without the capacity for sex and marriage, those who are made by others without the capacity for sex and marriage, and those who choose to live without sex and marriage for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Paul said that the one who is unmarried because of a calling should be holy both in body and in spirit. We see that in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 34. So therefore, these eunuchs, for the kingdom of heaven's sake, should come to peace with their celibacy, both physically and spiritually. It should not be a consistent torment to them in either aspect. If it is a consistent torment, then they were not meant to be celibate. This is why we see some priests get into trouble, because they're fighting a losing battle if God didn't create them to be celibate. That's a special calling, and not everyone has it. In verses 13 through 15, we see that Jesus blesses the children. So in verse 13 it says, "Then little children were brought to him that he might put his hands on them and pray, but the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven.' And he laid his hands on them and departed from there." So Jesus goes from teaching about marriage and divorce to teaching about how we should care for children. In Psalms 127, verse 4 and 5, it says, "Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gates." So according to the Bible, children are a treasure. And this is a profound statement made by Vernon McGee. He once said that there is one thing far worse than going to hell, my friend. It's going to hell holding the hand of your child. See, parents have a charge to love Jesus and to teach our children to love Jesus. In those times, priorities were men were always considered first, women took a distant second, and children were seen but not heard. It was not unheard of for parents to bring their children to rabbis for prayer or blessings. But the disciples were a hindrance for bringing children to Jesus. And as a church, we need to make sure we are not a hindrance. Sometimes parents tend to make their children the center of the family. We want them to have the best schooling, the best sports, the best activities. And there's nothing wrong with wanting the best for your children. However, we can't neglect the precepts of what the Bible is teaching us here. Bring the children to Jesus. We need to have a Jesus-centered home, not a child-centered home. How do you know if you have a child-centered home? If the child interrupts adults when they're talking. If they use manipulation and rebellion to get their way. If they dictate the family schedule. If the child takes precedence over the needs of the spouse. If the child has an equal or overriding vote in all decisions. If the child demands excessive time and attention from parents. If the child escapes the consequences of their sinful and irresponsible behavior. If they speak to parents as though they're peers. If they're the dominant influence in the family. If they're entertained and coddled rather than disciplined out of a bad mood. If some of these examples are problematic in your home, I recommend a wonderful parenting resource called Growing Kids God's Way, Biblical Ethics for Parenting by Gary Ezzo. And you can find that on Amazon for $58. And no, I don't get any royalties for that. But it is a great curriculum. In Genesis 2:24, it says, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." The husband and wife must become first, as it was from the very beginning. The tenses used in the Greek is basically saying, let the children come to me starting now. Don't forbid them from coming. So things that we can glean from this is Jesus wants to reach children with the gospel. As a matter of fact, the older a person is that hasn't heard the gospel, the less likely they will be receptive to it. So we need to reach them early. Mark 10, verse 16, and he, referring to Jesus, took them up in his arms, put his hands on them, and blessed them. The picture is Jesus taking each individual child, one by one, holding them and blessing them. So where do they find Jesus? In you, by the way you live your life and by the way you treat them. There's a great poem that I want to share that illustrates that. It's called When You Thought I Wasn't Looking. So when you thought I wasn't looking, you hung my first painting on the refrigerator, and I wanted to paint another. When you thought I wasn't looking, you fed a stray cat, and I thought it was good to be kind to animals. When you thought I wasn't looking, you baked a birthday cake just for me, and I knew that the little things were special things. When you thought I wasn't looking, you said a prayer, and I believed there was a God that I could always talk to. When you thought I wasn't looking, you kissed me goodnight, and I felt loved. When you thought I wasn't looking, I saw tears come from your eyes, and I learned that sometimes things hurt, but that it's all right to cry. When you thought I wasn't looking, you smiled, and it made me want to look that pretty too. When you thought I wasn't looking, you cared, and I wanted to be everything I could be. When you thought I wasn't looking, I looked, and I wanted to say thanks for all the things you did when you thought I wasn't looking. Isn't that nice? So Jesus now teaches on riches and following him. So in verses 16 and 17, it says, we see a man ask Jesus about gaining eternal life. So beginning in verse 16, "Now behold, one came and said to him, 'Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?' So he said to him, 'Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, and that is God. But if you want to enter into eternal life, keep the commandments.'" So this question demonstrates that this man, like all people by nature, had an orientation towards earning eternal life. He wanted to know what good work or noble deed he could do to inherit eternal life. Now, all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell us this man was rich. Matthew tells us he was young, and Luke tells us he was a ruler. So why do you call me good? In this, Jesus did not deny his own goodness. Instead, he asked the man, do you understand what you're saying when you call me good? And Spurgeon said it was as if Jesus said, you come to me asking about what good thing you can do to inherit eternal life, but what do you really know about goodness? The argument is clear. Either Jesus was good, or he ought not have called him good. But there is none good but God. Jesus, who is good, must be God. In verse 17, if you want to enter into eternal life, keep the commandments. Jesus answers the man's question. Jesus' answer to the man's question was straightforward. If you want to gain eternal life by your doing, you must keep the commandments, all of them, and keep them in the fullest. So in verses 18 through 20, Jesus tests him by the aspects of the Mosaic law that deal with a man's relationship to men. He said to him, which ones? Jesus said, you shall not commit murder. You should not murder, you should not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you should not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said to him, all of these things I have kept from my youth. What do I still lack? So let's go back to verse 18, you shall not murder. So Jesus asked the man about the commandments which primarily deal with the man's relation to man. So in response, the young man claimed, all these things I've kept from my youth, thus claiming to fulfill all God's commandments regarding how we must treat other people. And then in verse 20, all these things I've kept from my youth. So it's fair to ask if this man really had kept these commandments. It is likely that he actually did keep them in a way that made him righteous in the eyes of men, in the sense that Paul could say concerning the righteousness which is in the law blameless in Philippians 3:6. But he certainly did not keep them in the full and perfect sense which Jesus spoke of in the Sermon on the Mount. So Mark 10:21 tells us that in response to the man's answer, Jesus loved him. Jesus had compassion on this man, who was so misguided as to think that he really could justify himself before God. So in his question, what do I still lack? This alone tells us that this man had not perfectly kept the law because he still knew that there was something missing in his life, prompting the question, what do I still lack? There was still something lacking in his life, reflecting something missing in his relationship with God. And in verses 21 through 22, so Jesus said to him, if you want to be perfect, go, sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me. But when the young man heard the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. The call to forsake everything and follow Jesus is a call to put God first in all things. It is full obedience to the first table of the law, which dealt with a man's relation to God. We may make two mistakes here. The one is to believe this applies to everyone, when Jesus never made this a general command to all who would follow him, but especially to the one rich man whose riches were clearly an obstacle to his discipleship. Instead, many rich people can do more good in the world by continuing to make money and using those resources for the glory of God and the good of others. The second mistake is to believe this applies to no one, when there are clearly those today for whom the best thing they could do for themselves spiritually is to radically forsake the materialism that is ruining them. So this begs the question, what is your idol? Yet, we notice that Jesus simply called this man to be his disciple and saying, follow me. He used similar language in calling many of his disciples. We see examples throughout Matthew and Mark on that. Jesus simply called this man to be his follower, but for this man, it meant leaving behind the riches he had set his heart upon. And then in verse 22, it says, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. In this, the wealthy questioner failed utterly. Money was his God. He was guilty of idolatry. This is why Jesus, knowing the man's heart, asked him to renounce his possessions. So the principle remains. God may challenge and require an individual to give something up for the sake of his kingdom that he still allows to someone else. There are many who perish because they will not forsake what God tells them to do. So in verse 22, we see sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And the theologian Clark said, and what were these in comparison of peace of conscience and mental rest? Besides, he had unequivocal proof that these contributed nothing to his comfort, for he is now miserable even while he possesses them. So will every soul be who puts worldly goods in the place of the supreme God. So in verses 23 through 26, we see riches as an obstacle to the kingdom. In verse 23, it says, Then Jesus said to his disciples, Assuredly I say to you that it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. So when his disciples heard it, they were greatly astonished, saying, Who then can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said to them, With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. So back to verse 24, it says, It is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. So riches are a problem because they tend to make us satisfied with this life instead of longing for the age to come. And sometimes riches are sought at the expense of seeking God. We get so busy making a living that we forget the real reason we were created in the first place, to have relationship with the living God. The illustration that Jesus used, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, was meant to be somewhat humorous. We immediately think of this as being impossible. After all, the camel was the largest common animal trying to squeeze through the smallest imaginable hole. But it's a good picture of how strong our convictions can be toward our possessions and how hard it can be to choose Jesus above all else when blessed with such possessions. One problem with riches is that they encourage a spirit of false independence, very much like the church of Laodicea, where they said, I am rich, I have become wealthy, and have need of nothing. You can find that in Revelations 3, verse 17. They were exceedingly amazed. The great amazement of the disciples was based on the assumption that riches was always a sign of God's blessing and favor. And God does want to bless you, and because the more you're blessed, the more you're able to help others. However, Jesus wants to make sure that we don't put mammon before God. After all, we can't serve two masters. In verse 26, with God, all things are possible. It is possible for the rich man to be saved. God's grace is enough to save the rich man. And we have the examples in people like Zacchaeus, Joseph of Arimathea, and Barnabas. All these were rich men, but still able to put God first, not the riches. And then that caused Peter to ask a blunt question. What do we get for following you? So in verse 27, it says, Then Peter answered and said to him, See, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? So Jesus said to them, Assuredly I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. So verse 27 says, Therefore, what shall we have? So in contrast to the rich young ruler, the disciples did leave all to follow Jesus. So what would be their reward? Jesus tells of a special honor for the disciples. You who have followed me will also sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. The disciples will have a special role in the future judgment, probably in the sense of administration in the millennial kingdom. So as well, the apostles had the honor of helping to provide a singular foundation for the church. We see that in Ephesians 2:20. It says, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus as the chief cornerstone. And then have a special tribute in the New Jerusalem, and we find that in Revelations 21:14. It says, the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So in verse 29, everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters. But there will be universal honor for all who sacrifice for Jesus' sake. Whatever has been given up for him will be returned to us 100 times over, in addition to everlasting life. So 100-fold is obviously not literal in the material sense. Otherwise, Jesus promised 100 mothers and 100 wives. Jesus will do more than make up what we had given up for his sake. But the return may be spiritual instead of material. 100-fold certainly is literally true in the spiritual sense. Matthew Poole describes some of the ways we can get our 100-fold by joy in the Holy Spirit, peace of conscience, the sense of God's love, contentment. They shall have a contented frame of mind. God will stir up the hearts of others to supply their wants, and that supply shall be sweeter to them than their abundance was. And God sometimes repays them in this life, as he restores Job as he restored Job after his trial to greater riches. So the principle stands. God will be a debtor to no man. It is impossible for us to give more to God than he gives back to us. And doesn't this sound like the law of reciprocity or the principle of tithing? Jesus understands the sacrifice. That's why he restores it 100-fold. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. In the previous words, Jesus promised that those who sacrificed for his sake and the sake of his kingdom would be rewarded. Then he said that though they would be rewarded, it would be different than man usually expects, because we usually believe that the first will be first and the last will be last. The parable in the following chapter will illustrate this principle. Jesus lays it down that there will be surprises in the final assessment, and it may be that those who were humble on earth will be great in heaven, and those who were great in this world will be humbled in the world to come. There's an old Romish legend which contains a great truth. It says there was a brother who preached very mightily and who had won many souls to Christ. And it was revealed to him one night in a dream that in heaven he would have no reward for all that he had done. He asked to whom the reward would go. And an angel told him that it would go to an old man who used to sit on the pulpit stairs and pray for him. Well, it may be so, though it is more likely that both would share the master's praise. We shall not be rewarded, however, simply according to our apparent success. So regardless of our understanding of it, each of us must run our race until the end. It is far better to try and fail than to never try at all. And what a great comfort it will be when we finished our race, we may hear those wonderful words of our Savior. Well done, good and faithful servant. Awesome. Isn't that good? All right, so I know I touched on some really sensitive issues at the beginning of the lesson. Does anybody have any comments or questions about any of the issues that I raised? Because I know that we're in a culture today where the church is trying to be woke, and I don't want to be a woke church. I want to be an awake church. I want to be aware of the enemy's snares of what they're trying to do to send us in the wrong direction. So it's important that we speak the truth, no matter how hard it can be sometimes. Larry, you got a question?
Yes, I was just wondering. I noticed that a lot of from the text, the man could divorce the woman. Why couldn't the woman divorce the man? Or was that that wasn't possible? Or what?
Well, they didn't have the same standing as the man did, but I would imagine that they would also have that opportunity, but I don't know for sure, to be honest with you. That's a good question. I mean, but I do know that, back then, like I said, the men had more of the standing and could do those kind of things.
Right, just in the culture.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? No? Wow.
Wow, you really covered it, brother.
I know I talked a lot, explained a lot.
Or you scared them.
Or I'm scaring them, yeah.
Scarred.
It's okay.
I'm scared.
So, all right, well.
Wait, one more.
I appreciated the comment about the what's that word? What is it?
Pornea.
Pornea.
Yeah.
I always wondered why, it was never said, and many ministers have told women, or maybe men, but women, mostly women, to go back to a husband that beat them, But what it was is that it wasn't explained correctly to them, I guess. But
yeah,
you explained it very well. I appreciated that.
You're welcome. Yeah, and I think that's sometimes that's what happens whenever we don't go find what the intent and what the actual word was used, and whenever we go look at the Greek and see what the word was used, we see, okay, this actually has a broad, or maybe a broader meaning, or maybe a more narrow focus of meaning. So it's important, the versions that we read, the great versions, stuff like that, but a lot of them have references to what that word is. So it's good to always resort back to what that original intent was.
But if you don't explain, because if you just read it straight up, as you read it, as it's written in the Gospels.
Yeah.
If you didn't understand, like you explained what the word means, the full context of the word, well, a good number of people in the church would be in trouble.
Right.
Yeah, you read that and you don't understand. You go, oh my God, I'm living in adultery. Well, no, you're not. You just don't understand the context of what he was saying and the fullness, and you brought that out very well.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and I struggled with that myself. Being divorced and
Well,
remarried. Wondered. You start reading this and like, man,
Am I in trouble?
Yeah, am I in trouble? But in researching it and finding out what all these means, like, okay, it just makes me appreciate the grace that we receive from Jesus all the much more, because I know I've asked for forgiveness, and things like that,
Sure.
and I just glad that God can still use me.
I love that story though, with the woman at the well. Go get your husband. Well, I'm not married, and Jesus said, "Yeah, I know you've had." You had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with now is not your husband.
Right.
I love it. Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. No kidding.
Right.
I love that part right there. Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Yeah,
Yeah.
you just ran headlong into a buzzsaw right there.
So that's encouraging that many of us, and especially in the church, even in the church, it's almost 50%
Right.
divorce rate. So there's a lot of people in the church today that feel like they can't be used because they've been through a divorce maybe once or
Exactly.
twice, and that's just not the case. I mean,
No.
God still has a plan for you and a purpose for your life. So
That's
don't let
right.
those obstacles keep you from His purpose.
Well, and I think exactly what you're saying there. A lot of it comes from misinterpretation by people in and out of the church, but even a lot of people in the church and some church organizations themselves.
Yes.
They'll take one portion and totally omit another portion,
Right.
because it fits their agenda or their subscribed laws. Just like the Pharisees and Sadducees, they had their list of rules, and so it's like, here's our list, and therefore, what we have to do is really recognize the whole gospel and the whole counsel. And so I appreciate you bringing the balance to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, some of the most judgy people are in the church. It's because we want to go by the letter of the law. And, even though, like, I touched on homosexual marriage, even though God does not, approve of, homosexual marriage, He doesn't mean He doesn't love homosexuals. He loves them. He wants them to know His word, because whenever you start to learn who He is and who His character is, your heart will change. And that's how He changes and moves, and changes all of us. It doesn't matter homosexual or not. The more we learn about Him, that's, His Spirit dwells in us, and we're either going to run away from church, or we're going to run to it. So.
Well, and I do think it is important to make the point that churches sometimes have been the ones that are guilty of making you feel like, you use the terminology, the second-class citizen.
Right.
Or, there were times like the way they would handle things, like they would have an altar call and they were like, couples come down, and then they're like, oh, well, if you're single, go over here in the corner, kind of thing. And it was like, over here to the leper colony, we have the divorced people. That's how it felt. And I just think it's so important, first of all, that if we were raised in that, we just say, God, that is not from you. Please remove any thinking like that from
Right.
me. Subconsciously, that I would not think that way, but also to have that, what you're saying about grace, because after Paul and I got married, we've both been married before, and we went to a Bible study that specifically was talking about, like, if you get married, then that's adultery. And we're like, well, Lord, have mercy. And so literally, it's as simple as, Lord, forgive us. I remember one time when I was washing dishes at my sink, and that verse about God hates divorce just came to my mind, and I just was so grieved that even though I didn't want a divorce, that I had taken part in something that God hated, know. And but I felt like He saw my heart as like, Lord, I don't want to do anything that displeases you, And even if at that time I did want to, His forgiveness is still available and His grace. And I just think we, especially if 40% of people have blended families,
Right.
we've got to have that message, because like what you're saying, what is sad is that during that time, the church could have been the biggest house of healing for families that were broken.
Absolutely.
And instead, they shunned them and made them feel dirty or whatever. And like you're saying, now there are more coming out, the blended family information from a godly standpoint. We said that it would have made our life so much easier,
Yes.
after we heard some of the seminars on the blended families. I was the one who wanted to put them all in the blender and y'all all get along and be one,
Right.
and that isn't how it works. So I think it was really good you brought out that point, and I think that needs to be a constant message this day and age, that we be proactive in saying God still has a good future for
Yes.
you,
Yep.
and not for harm. So.
Yep. Those plans and promises are still as much as true today as they were, before you got your divorce. God knows you. He's got a plan for you, and don't let any of those obstacles. And that's just the enemy. That's another lie of the enemy. He tries to make you think that you're second class, and you're not. You're still first class to God, and God still wants to utilize you and His kingdom and to reaching others.
Well, there's a denomination that I'll not mention, because everybody would know it, but there's no reason to mention it. But what they have done is they've painted themselves in a corner, and they can't get out because of the stance, especially with who are in ministry.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a really funny joke, but it was. I mean, I've been around ministers, so I'd been better if I'd have killed my wife than divorce her. Because you divorce her, that you're done. You're
Right.
done.
Yeah.
And one thing I like about our fellowship, Grace International, that we're a part of, and it's been that way for years. It was CEA, Christian Evangelistic Assemblies, but then it's changed its name over these past several years to Grace International. And one thing I realized, because a lot of the guys that came in to be a part of our ministry had gone through divorce. I can think of several. Mm-hmm. But what their stance was is they looked at every situation. They looked at Paul and Michelle's situation was different from this couple over here.
Yeah.
Now this couple over here, like you said, they're just boneheads, and you're just not repenting. So, but then these guys over here didn't want it, but it happened. So they took because I for a long time there, for several years, I was the state director for the churches in Texas. Mm-hmm. And so I would interview a lot of these guys, and we would talk to them individually, and say, okay, we'll just explain the situation, what happened. And then we would look at the whole picture. And then, we would say, okay, well, we understand that. We understand what's going on, what's happened here. And we would, they would be fine to be a part of ministry and receive credentials and stuff.
Yeah.
But again, this other denomination, man, you're just signing a death warrant, man,
mm-hmm.
for your ministry.
Yep.
If you get a divorce.
Yeah.
Your wife could be, crazy as a loon, or your husband could be crazy and do whatever he did, but doesn't matter.
Right.
There was no exceptions.
Yeah.
You get a divorce, you're done.
Yeah.
You can't have papers anymore. So it's crazy.
And it goes back to God gave us free will, and
Right.
because of that free will, sometimes our hearts get hardened, and we see that so many times throughout the Bible that their hearts were hardened, mm-hmm. and they wouldn't listen. I mean, even the stuff that you see before you just won't listen.
Right.
And in those kind of situations, God can't work whenever
Right.
you refuse to let Him.
Right.
So, God will come as close to you as you want Him to be, or He'll stand back as
Right.
far away from you as you want Him to be. And
Well, that's it. We're free moral agents.
yeah, and and that hardness of the heart is what keeps us from being able to reconcile whatever those cases are.
Yeah.
Whatever the situation is. Because I'm a firm believer, even though I've been through a divorce, that all things are possible. If we humble ourselves, if we work through things or whatever. But sometimes you just can't, and God understands that. He understands that. What, we got that free will, we got that stubbornness.
Well, the Bible's real clear. Proverbs 12:1. He who doesn't receive correction is stupid.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it uses the word stupid.
Yeah.
Don't be stupid.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining in with us. Don't be stupid.
Yeah, let me leave you with this. Don't be stupid.
But we love you. Go in God's grace and have a blessed week. And we look forward to seeing you next weekend.